All right, let's get started with another lesson. Now, looking at that title, 1:7, you might be freaking out right now, thinking I didn't sign up for a math lesson. Or maybe if you're looking at it in a different viewpoint, you might be thinking, well, that's not today's date. And that brings us to the question, what was I thinking with this title? And really, I don't think it's that complex. All it really is a simple ratio. 1 out of every 7. Now, if it's not already painfully obvious what today's lesson is on, it's on the Sabbath, which is the day of rest and worship. But how we view Sabbath really is reflective of the doctrines we hold and how we apply them to the Bible, or apply them to our lives, that is. Looking at all the 10 Commandments again, there they all are. But the Sabbath, also referred to as the Lord's Day, is a very unique commandment since it's the only one that majority of Christians believe that it is not applicable to modern day Christians. But that leaves us to a big question: why? Why do many modern day Christians think this is not for us? What makes this law any different than the rest of these 10 Commandments? Many argue that, well, it's a Jewish law, it's the Abrahamic covenant, we're not under that, and so it's not applicable. Which I would respond with, well, none of the other 10 Commandments are specifically for the Jews or the Israelites. Last time I checked, murdering, lying, and stealing is still wrong for all people, not just Israelites. It's wrong for you and I. So others also mention, well, it's not specifically mentioned not to or to do the Sabbath in the New Testament, which I would kind of retort with on the contraire. It's quite the opposite, I'd say. Not necessarily that it doesn't say do it, but you don't see any breaking of the Sabbath, you could say. People still seem to follow it. But let's look at the actual verse in Exodus and tear it apart. So in Exodus it says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your sons, nor your daughters, nor your male servants, nor your female servants, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates." The very first word sets this law apart, since it's the only one of the laws that start out with the word remember. Almost as if God already knew that we would forget this law and tried to put in some extra reminders. It's like, hey, here's a law. Remember. Don't forget this one. Now, the next words that kind of popped out to me was the word keep. Similar to the word remember, but more applicable since remember is more of the mental state, you're thinking about it, and keep is the application, the working out of, and so you could think of it as keep as continually preserve. If you don't keep this, then you'll slowly stop obeying this one and you'll forget it. Now, what are we keeping, of course? That brings us to the question. It's the seventh day as holy, set apart, sacred. And how is this achieved? Well, it says simply by doing no work. That's all you got to do. Now, there's one last thing to be noticed for words that kind of, or two actually, that kind of make it interesting, is the word your. Your son, your daughter, your servant, your female servant, your cattle, your stranger. These kind of show a top-down structure, you could say somewhat of ownership, and so it is up to your responsibility not to work your children or your servants or your workers or your animals or whatnot. So, and that kind of brings us to the next interesting words that pop up. The word cattle and stranger. Those alone seem to debunk the premise of only Jews or Israelites being able or needing to obey this law. Because last time I checked, animals aren't religious. And stranger were the exact, or is talking exactly about those who are not Israelites that were with them, or who came and went and were there for a time period. It, said to them it still applies. But now if you're still not convinced over if this law is for everyone, or if it's just for the Jews, let's continue on to the very next verse in Exodus. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that it is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So the very next verse of giving the law, God reminds his people where the origin of the law came from, which is creation, and it's been practiced since then. Now, disobeying this law, I think, is very strange. Even though many of us do, it's kind of, in my mind, a boss telling you, well, all right, take the next week off or take a vacation, all expense paid, and you're like, no, I'm not going to do it. And it's like, but why would you not take a vacation? It's like, all expense paid, right? You don't need to pay for it. You're just going to go on vacation. Why do you love work that much, So that's kind of my mind. And why we should obey it. It should just come easy. It's like, oh, you want to take a day off? Oh, yeah, sure. Why not? I'll take a day off, once a week. Sounds good to me. But, many of us have a hard time doing that, especially when we live hectic lives. But the main thing with this verse is you really want to point out is that the origin of this law came from creation. So you really can't say that, oh, this is only for the Israelites. Well, the Israelites didn't come till long time later than creation. Looking at more verses, though, in Exodus, let's look in chapter 31. It says, you shall keep the Sabbath, therefore it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the 7th is the Sabbath of rest. So really, this verse is just hitting how hard or how bad it is, in a sense, that how serious God took it. He's given the death penalty just for a person working. So you might want to think twice about it, per se. Now, that brings us to the question of what was considered work. What can and can't we do? And now, looking at it, in the Old Testament, there's actually, I would say, only a few passages that directly kind of give context, as in doing this and not doing that, and kind of like that. But there's a lot of situations, obviously, that just say don't do work, but don't give too much more than that. So it's kind of hard to say. But let's look at the ones that we can find. In Exodus 31, it says, 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. In it, plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. So this is kind of, I would say, two things. This is showing that, okay, farming is work, plow and harvest. Then at the same time, you can look at those words again in a different way as saying, okay, during plowing season, during harvest season. It doesn't say, oh, you only get to take a break half of the year. No, it's year round. During both times, you still got to take a day off and rest. And so that's kind of, we see that the work, what's considered work is farming, and this would be, a job. Now let's look at another passage. In Numbers 15, it says, now while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all congregation. They put him under guard because it had not been explained what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, the man must surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So as the Lord commanded Moses, all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died. Now, the text doesn't explain for what purpose this man was gathering sticks. But I think in this case, you have to consider that what he was doing must have been laborious, kind of tiresome, actual work. I don't think that he was just walking on his way on a hike, and as we kind of do when you're on a hike, you find a stick that's like a nice walking stick, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna pick this up and walk with it. Now, I don't think it was just one stick. As you can see, it says sticks, so this must have been his job or just something he was doing that the society at that time was considering work. So I don't think it was just a couple sticks, and I don't think it was just he was bored and doing this. It was actual work. But it's hard to say if that was his like job title, picking up sticks for wood kindling or starting fires or something like that. It doesn't give much context on that, but we do have to say that whatever it was, it must have been work, must have been tiresome for him. Looking at another passage in Nehemiah, it says, in those days I saw people in Judah treading wine press on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them about the day on which they were selling provisions. Men of Tyre dwelt, which they were selling provisions. Messed up. They also who brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. So when I read this, what I see is kind of like a picture of Judah, in Jerusalem, that there's just like the hustle and bustle of society. They're just working. And Nehemiah is just bemoaning the fact that they are, pointing out, that some of them are working, creating wine by, that's a difficult task by stepping on them. That's generally how it was done back then. And then loading up donkeys with different things that they plan on selling, the wine that was just being created, grapes and figs and all kinds of different things it says that were being loaded up, and those are obviously going to be moved out. And that's the thing is Nehemiah pointed out to even the donkey. Remember that donkeys, even the animals, weren't supposed to be working on the Sabbath. But also, it looks as though kind of says men of Tyre dwelt there and, started selling goods and stuff, and the children of Israel kind of were buying it. And so you kind of just see this business that was going on, and just that was what you shouldn't have been doing. And so I think a lot of part of Sabbath is related to business. There's a business aspect that businesses should kind of be closed. You shouldn't be working your employees, and kind of that aspect to it. Just kind of work related. Now let's read one last one. See, for the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you on the 6th day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. Now, if you read this within just this verse, you might think, okay, on the Sabbath day, you're not allowed to leave your house. And you're only stuck there, okay? Now, I would ask, how does one worship God, though, in church or whatnot, if that was the case? How do you leave your house? There might be some situation you need to. And so I think if you read this verse alone, you might be confused. But if you look in the context of it, this is talking about the manna, and I think the context is really explaining don't leave the house to get the manna that's not there. You remember, they were given the previous day to collect double the amount of manna, and then the next day they weren't supposed to gather manna. And so I really think that's kind of an interesting thing going on there. Now, that brings us to the question, what about Jesus? Okay, many people bring up Jesus when talking about the Sabbath and state that, oh, Jesus broke the Sabbath left and right. That's why we don't have to obey the Sabbath. But I don't believe that to be the case. Jesus obviously had to be perfect and did not break any laws. So how did he do the things he did when people are accusing him of breaking the Sabbath? And what did he say? Because he did say some very interesting things to go in connection to the Sabbath. So the first one is in Mark. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" But he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath." So the Pharisees, they see Jesus and the 12 disciples, quote unquote, farming, you could say. They were probably looking back at one of the previous verses that we looked at of the farming, like, oh, they got upset. They're like, oh, they're breaking that specific law. But Jesus responds in a very interesting manner, as he always does. And he kind of responds by asking, well, kind of what law are you specifically pointing to? The one that God set up or the one you created? Because if we're looking at the one you just made up for the Pharisees, then the situation that David was in, desperate need of food, then he would have sinned. And they obviously didn't think that was the case in that situation. And especially since there really wasn't any law prohibiting David doing what he did. I was trying to search for one in the Old Testament, but couldn't find anything. It seems like he was lawful in what he did. And so, in a roundabout way, Jesus was kind of asking, so is starvation rest? Is that what we're supposed to do on the Sabbath? Every Sabbath we just starve because we stay in our homes and we just don't eat. In which I was bringing an interesting question. They didn't accuse him of breaking a Sabbath for leaving his house. They accused him of the farming aspect of it. So we can kind of conclude also with this one that you can leave your house. But the main point here is, the food aspect that you can eat, obviously. Jesus goes on to state the purpose was meant for our good, to rest, not to be a burden. So clearly Jesus was showing what the true meaning of the law is. That which allows man to rest and abstain from work is law. So Jesus wasn't considering picking a few grain around them to be considered work, but just a form of eating and kind of necessary. It was necessary to eat instead of starve. Well, let's look at another passage. In Matthew, it says, "Now when he had departed from there, he went into their synagogue. And behold, there was a man who had withered hand. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him. Then he said to them, What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value, then, is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, Stretch out your hand, and he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other." So in this situation, Jesus was about to heal a man, and they argued, "No, you can't do this since it's work." And Jesus responds by saying, well, if a sheep falls in a pit, potentially injured, now what do? Do you just look down in the pit and say, well, I'm sorry, it's the Sabbath, I'll be back tomorrow, and hope you haven't died by then? No, of course not. You rescue the animal and treat the wounds. So likewise, Jesus is helping this man by healing him, putting him into a state of rest. So this brings up the question, well, what about doctors? Can doctors work? And I would say one shouldn't actively seek out work, but if it's urgent, just as Jesus' example of the sheep, then it is allowed, since it's for the well-being and health of others. But if it's something like a routine checkup, something that just could have been scheduled on any other day that's not pressing, then I don't really think one should do it. And so it's really, with this context, it's talking about the urgency. Whatever is urgent, that is for the benefit of others, that is good, then that's okay. That will not, be considered work. Looking at another verse in Luke, it says, "Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bent over, and could in no way raise herself up. But when Jesus saw her, he called her to him, and said to her, 'Woman, you are loosed from your infirmity.' And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, and he said to the crowd, 'There are 6 days on which men ought to work. Therefore come and be healed on them, not on the Sabbath day.' The Lord then answered him and said, 'Hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall, and lead it away to water it? So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan was bound, think of it, for 18 years be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day?' And when he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him." So this was a similar example that Jesus healed a woman on the Sabbath, and a ruler of the synagogue was angry, saying there are 6 other days that she could have been healed. Today was meant for rest. Go somewhere else, in a sense. And Jesus responded by reminding him that he and many others would remove the bonds put on animals and walk them to drink. Then turns back to the woman, saying, "Think about this for a moment. This woman has been locked in her bonds for 18 years, unable to truly rest. What better day to relieve her of her ailments than the Sabbath?" This left everyone in awe and simply won the argument. Now, I could go on and on with different examples of healings, because Jesus seemed to heal a lot on the Sabbath. But we have a couple other verses I do want to look at. In Luke 6:9, it says, "Then Jesus said to them, 'I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful for on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to destroy it?'" So this is really Jesus just asking what really quantifies as okay to do on a Sabbath. And Jesus is really just saying, obviously, that which is good. So, whether when you're thinking back of, should I do this or not? Well, first ask, is it a good thing that you're doing? If not, then maybe don't do it. But the kind of another verse, it says in Luke, "Now he," which is Jesus, "was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath." Now, I bring up this verse because many times when we talk about the Sabbath, a lot of people ask, well, what about pastors and teachers and anyone else working in the church on a Sunday, as a lot of times people ask. And you kind of have to go back to the previous verses as well. Is it good? Okay, teaching and preaching, that's good. So you can generally just think about that as, that's not really work. Especially for me in teaching and whatnot, a lot of people say that, pastors are, worshiping. It's the act of worship for preaching. What the work aspect is actually preparing the lesson. I can definitely agree with that, the half week that I spend on these sometimes, it's a lot of work. It's just thinking, trying to find verses that, make sense, and trying to read the context and trying to make sure it's accurate, and you're setting up the slides and, all that work to be done. That's work. But, actually giving the lesson and teaching it, that's not too bad. It's pretty easy. So there's kind of that. So teaching, you're helping out others. You're pouring into the lives of others. And that's what makes it good. So that's not really something that is work. So Jesus did not break the Sabbath, but truly, I would say, fulfilled it by teaching and healing. And so really just when something is if you're not certain if it is breaking the Sabbath or not, just think of it, is it a good action or is it not? But let's look at the purposes and application as a whole. I think, obviously, it's for rest for all. Everyone should have a day of rest, to abstain from work, and that includes school. I know for many in the college age range, that's difficult. A lot of times you'll push it off, procrastinate till the very last minute, and then Monday comes around, or the day before Monday, Sunday. It's like, oh, I still have lots of homework to do. Better pump it out and get it done. But we should be a little bit more responsible than that. Try and get it done on a Saturday or the day before, so that you can rest, that you have a day off, that you can just relax, worship God and whatnot. And that brings us to the next one, is worship. Obviously, you have time to attend a church on the Sabbath. Many, ask or say, it's like, oh, I wish I had time to know God more. But at the same time, they miss church because they go to work at that time, or many other reasons. They just don't set that time to actually worship God. But God created it just so that we had time to worship Him, to understand Him more. Without it, it's a little bit more difficult to go to church if there was no Sunday that most people did get off. I also believe that one of the purposes to be reflective to God's nature, that on the seventh day, God did rest in creation. He did that. So in the same way, we should do that. Now, also, I think it's a testimony. Just as Chick-fil-A and other businesses that do close on Sundays, that's a pretty big statement. Many people know why they're closed. They say, well, it's a religious reason they don't open up on Sundays. And people know it. Everyone know. That's kind of the running joke. It's like, oh, let's get Chick-fil-A and it's Sunday. It's like, oh, no, it's not open. But it's a really big testimony to others. Also, it's an act of compassion to not overwork your employees. That's why you got to give them rest. You can't work them 7 days a week. That would just be nonsense. It's also, I would say, testing or reliance aspect, just as the manna was, that God said, okay, you got the previous day to the Sabbath day to gather twice as much. And this next day, you can relax, and you don't need to get any because you'll have enough for others. And so the same thing is like with work. You can work 6 days a week. The seventh day, do you trust that God will provide for you? Really, that kind of brings down the question. And that's kind of like, well, it combats greed in that sense, that you are relying on God if you really are living that tightly, that you are considering working on a Sunday. But also, another, I think, aspect is it helps families, because it forces them to spend time together, because many times families are all doing their own little things during the week, but on the weekends they might be off of work and have time to hang out, watch a movie or do whatever. But the main thing is to spend more time with each other, even going to church together. Definitely there's that. And so there's many benefits and things that can be thought about within the Sabbath. It's like, well, are you able to, play games for like football? Well, I think sports can be relaxing in a way. Obviously, if you were on a sports team, though, that takes their games on Sundays, then I think one should definitely avoid that team or sport or whatnot, because if it's going to withhold you from going to church, then don't do it. Or if that's the case, find a different church that's not on a Sunday. Go to one that starts on Saturday. So the Sabbath, I think, helps society as a whole by unifying the family and putting the focus on God. So obedience to the Sabbath had massive sociological impact, especially when we had blue laws that aren't necessarily real legal laws, but a lot of businesses did shut down on Sundays or did not open. And the only thing people really could do when this was the case would go to church or just stay home. And so just like I was saying, that brought unity to the family because you're stuck. That's the only thing you could do. Stay home because everything else is closed. And so a lot of people did. Now, I actually remember I used to live in a town that was much more rural, and I think for the most part, many things were closed. The only thing really open were some chain grocery stores and some other fast food restaurant places, I think. But for the most part, a lot of stuff were closed, and you wake up on a Sunday, it just seemed peaceful. It was very nice. And it would be nice if society did that again, just said, okay, everyone, nothing's going to be open on a Sunday, but we are a nonstop society nowadays. We're just always on the go. But I don't think that's really healthy for us as, society. We need to rest. God told us to. And you could really go on to say all the scientific proof of like, oh, you'll die earlier and just all that kind of stuff. But I think that's kind of just a given. You got to take rest. Now that brings us to the question. Well, is it Sunday or is it Saturday? Well, what day? And the Old Testament, they kind of would have considered it Saturday because it's the end of the week, the seventh day. But the New Testament church started to worship on the first day of the week. Now, why was this? Well, Jesus resurrected on Sunday. And so it was representative of Jesus' resurrection. And you could think of every Sunday, actually, because of this, as Easter Sunday. It's actually, that's why we do it, kind of, back before. But now we only, have an actual Easter to remember Jesus' resurrection once a year. But, the early church really wanted to focus on that. And so that's why they decided to do Sunday worship instead of Saturday, but also they did want to distinguish themselves from the Jews who did worship on Saturday. Now, you might be thinking, well, you can't just change days. If God said Saturday, then it's Saturday. But, well, let's look what Paul said. In Romans, it says one person esteems one day above another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. So this is talking about the ability to choose one day or every day to worship God. Not necessarily the other way around, that no, you can't just say no days at all to worship God. No, God deserves his worship and should be worshipped at least one day out of the week. That's all he asks. The other thing you want to think about, though, in this context of this verse is kind of about judging others for worshiping on a different day. Don't think yourself more holy or spiritual than others if you're like, oh, well, I go to a church that worships on Saturday, we're doing it the original way, we're better than you. No, that's not the case. It seems here that you can pick any day that you want to be your Sabbath day, but I put an asterisk on that because there's another verse that's kind of, I think, correlated to this that you can think about is in Hebrews. It says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as ye see the day approaching. So, yes, you can pick any day you want. It could be Wednesday, it could be Thursday, whatever, to be your Sabbath day. As long as you do that consistently, that's fine. But are you able to go to church on that day? Are you able to assemble with the rest of the church? But I don't believe that to be the case. And I don't think you can just say, well, I will read a chapter in my Bible today and consider that church. No, that's a lot different than what happens at church. It's a lot less. And you probably should be reading a chapter a day anyways. But I think that's what this is saying, is like, yeah, pick a day, but make sure you actually go to church, not just say that you're worshiping God. I don't think you can replicate what you do at church at home too easily. Sure, you might be able to watch a clip on TV or on the internet, but still, you're not really fellowshipping with the church. And I think that's part of the Sabbath day. So, but that is to say, if you find a church that goes or convenes on a Saturday, as long as it's not a a cult, as some churches do, believe that Saturday is the only day one should be worshiping and think they're better, then you want to be careful about that. But if it is a normal church, and they worship on a Saturday, and that's your Saturday or your Sabbath, then go ahead. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So, kind of in conclusion, Psalms, it says, "This is the day which the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it." So, God gave us a day to rest. Let's give thanks to God that He gave us that. It could have made it set up that we didn't have a day of rest. That would be quite difficult for us. But just be thankful, lift God up in that, praise Him. And really, this subject could go on for a long time. Just really, I would say the main takeaway to think about is whether if you think something is work or not, consider, is it good? Is it, are you taking care of others? Is it urgent? Those are the things you really want to consider whether it is work or not. And obviously, abstain from work and your goal is to rest. So with that, thanks again for listening in. I'll see you next week.